And as we get started in the book of 1 Kings 18, we are dealing with Elijah, who at this time is opposing the powers that be in Israel, specifically Ahab and Jezebel and their rulership and the wickedness therein. And that is where we are in 1 Kings chapter 18. Let's start in verse 1. Now it happened after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, "Go, show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the face of the earth." So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria. Ahab called Obadiah, who was over the household. Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. For when Jezebel destroyed the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in a cave, and provided them with bread and water. Then Ahab said to Obadiah, "Go through the land, to all the springs of water, to all the valleys. Perhaps we will find grass and keep the horses and mules alive, and not have to kill some of the cattle." So they divided the land between them to survey it. Ahab went one way by himself, and Obadiah went another way by himself. Now as Obadiah was on the way, behold, Elijah met him, and he recognized him and fell on his face and said, "Is this you, Elijah, my master?" He said to him, "It is I. Go say to your master, behold, Elijah is here." He said, "What sin have I committed, that you are giving your servant into the hand of Ahab to put me to death? As the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my master has not sent to search for you." And when they said, "He is not here," he made the kingdom or nation swear that they could not find you. And now you are saying, "Go say to your master, behold, Elijah is here." It will come about that when I leave you, that the Spirit of the Lord will carry you where I do not know. So when I come and tell Ahab and he cannot find you, he will kill me, although I, your servant, have feared the Lord from my youth. Has it not been told to my master what I did when Jezebel killed the prophets of the Lord, that I hid 100 prophets of the Lord by 50s in a cave and provided them with bread and water? And now you are saying, "Go say to your master, behold, Elijah is here." He will then kill me. Elijah said, "As the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today." So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, "Is this you, you troubler of Israel?" He said, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and you have followed the Baals. Now then send and gather to me all Israel at Mount Carmel, together with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of the Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." So the context here is that it has not rained in the land for about 3 years. We know from James chapter 5 and verse 17 that the total amount of time there was not rain in Israel after Elijah prayed was 3.5 years, 3 years and 6 months. And that time is coming near for rain to be coming, as the Lord tells Elijah, but something has to happen first. And so Elijah presents himself to Ahab, and he uses Obadiah. He presents himself to Obadiah first, and we have a kind of almost a humorous interchange between the two, because Obadiah thinks, "Well, I must have done something wrong for you to ask this of me, because when I go and get Ahab, you're not going to be here and he's going to kill me." But Elijah assures himself to Obadiah that he is going to face Ahab, that he will be here when Obadiah comes back with Ahab. And Ahab does see Elijah, and they have this exchange where Ahab calls him the trouble of Israel. Ahab blames him for everything that has gone on. But Elijah points the blame rightly back at Ahab, that he and his father's household had not served the Lord, but rather were serving the Baals. And that is why this is happening. And he calls all Israel to Mount Carmel, but he also calls 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. Now, one thing that is interesting is that Baal is the god of storms. He was the god of rain and storms and lightning and all of those things. And the reason that the Israelites served him, the reason that the Israelites were so snared by Baal is the promise of plentiful harvest. If he was the god of storms, well, he could control the rains and therefore control the rains so that they would have a prosperous harvest and they themselves would be rich. Israel, the land of Israel, was agriculturally set up. It wasn't set up for mining minerals, or maybe up north with you have the cedars of Lebanon. They didn't have that. Their economy was built around agriculture. And so if it doesn't rain, they have a huge, huge problem, as they did because of this 3-year lack of rain in the land. We come to Ahab and Obadiah, and they're searching for any signs of water so they don't have to kill cattle, so they don't have to get rid of livestock because they can't feed them or water them properly. And all of this was brought on by their service of Baal, and ironically so. They served Baal because they wanted prosperous harvests, and yet they were having famine in the land. But Elijah summons the people of Israel, Ahab, and these prophets to settle something once and for all. Keep reading with me in verse 20. So Ahab sent a message among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel. Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him." But the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I alone am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Now let them give us 2 oxen, and let them choose 1 ox for themselves and cut it up, and place it on the wood, but put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other ox and lay it on the wood, and I will not put a fire under it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people said, "That is a good idea." So, Elijah meets the people. And he says, "How long will you falter between two opinions?" I have a note in my Bible that says it is literally limping on the two divided opinions, is the idea there. The idea is not that necessarily they were straddling the fence, but rather they were limping between these two opinions in such a way that they were injured, that they were not fully healthy, and they were very much confused in this, and also, of course, not doing what was right in trying to serve God and Baal at the same time. And he says, enough is enough. If the Lord is God, serve him. If Baal is God, serve him. And here's a way that we prove it. And so you have the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah versus Elijah. And in total, those are 850 prophets versus Elijah. Now I want you to notice something that Elijah says here. He says, "I alone am left a prophet of the Lord," in verse 22. Now that is not 100% true, but that is how Elijah felt, and we will see that in chapter 19. But that's seemingly not true, because Obadiah just mentioned that he had saved at least 100 prophets. The Lord mentions in chapter 19 that there were 7,000 who had not bowed their knee to Baal. Not all prophets, but 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed their knee to Baal. And the whole point of chapter 19 is that Elijah wasn't alone. But even in this challenge, we get a glimpse into Elijah's mindset even then. "I alone am left a prophet of the Lord." But as far as this challenge goes, he is correct. It is Elijah alone serving and following the Lord and representing the Lord versus 850 prophets, 450 to Baal, 400 to Asherah. We see Elijah's courage in this. I want you to think of this illustration for just a moment. Think about you going to a sports game, whatever your sport you like, if it's football, basketball. But I want you to imagine you're in a stadium of 100,000 people, and you are the only one cheering for your team. The only person in the entire stadium that is cheering for your team. Now, are you going to be loud and raucous and cheering every time your team does something good? Maybe, if you're a certain kind of fan. But most likely, you're going to be kind of nervous and maybe a little bit shy and a little bit reserved and say, every once in a while say, hey, that was a good play, good job, guys, to the other team, so that you don't stick out like a sore thumb. I'll take that a step further. What if your allegiances to your team meant that you were probably not going to make it out of there alive if you were to pipe up and show allegiance to that team? How courageous would you then be to cheer on your team amidst these 100,000 other people? That's essentially what Elijah is doing, except the stakes are much higher than a sports game, but rather he is representing the true God of heaven and earth versus these prophets and the people of Israel and Ahab and Jezebel, who all are on the side of Baal. And so we do have to note Elijah's courage in doing this. If this goes poorly, he could very well not make it out alive. Continue reading with me in verse 25. So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one ox for yourselves and prepare it first, for you are many, and call on the name of your God, but put no fire under it. Then they took the ox which was given them, and they prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they leapt about the altar which they made. It came about at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, call out with a loud voice, for he is a god. Either he is occupied or gone aside, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and needs to be awakened. So they cried with a loud voice and cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out on them. When midday was past, they raved until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, come near to me. So all the people came near to him. And he repaired the altar of the Lord which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, Israel shall be your name. So with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar, large enough to hold 2 measures of seed. Then he arranged the wood and cut the ox in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, fill 4 pitchers with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. And he said, do it a second time. And they did it a second time. And he said, do it a third time. And they did it a third time. The water flowed around the altar, and he also filled the trench with water. At the time of the evening offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord. Answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their heart back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. So here we have the contest borne out for us, what happened during the contest. And there are a few things that I'd like to observe about this. Number one, do you notice a difference in the worship of the two parties? The prophets of Baal, as they are trying to get their God to answer them, they are leaping about the altar, they are cutting themselves, and their blood is gushing. It says that they raved, which, quite frankly, I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I'm guessing some kind of weird ritualistic attitude and behavior. And they cried out with a loud voice and all of these things. And that was their way of worship. That was their way of calling upon God. But Elijah, as he is, at the time of the evening sacrifice, he came near, and it says he said. And I hope I'm not reading too much into the text here, but it doesn't say that he shouted. It doesn't say that he yelled. It doesn't say that he cried out. He said. This may very well have been a prayer that Elijah offered loud enough so that only he could hear it. And it's very tame. He's not leaping about the altar. He's not shouting. He's not spitting. He's not cutting himself. He says this prayer and, of course, gives the glory to God and all of that, and then the fire comes. And the point I want to make about that is that, really, you see this today, don't you? A difference in the worship that people want to do, the difference in worship that people feel most comfortable doing, and the worship that is prescribed in the New Testament. You can go to a number of churches that are claiming to serve God. And as I've been around people who have come from that background, one person described worship to me as there's the lights go dark and maybe you hear the band start to cue up and there's a countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then, this is his words, we would just get in there and start praising. And people are jumping, people are screaming. One person's over here, praying and maybe in tears on the ground. And one person is up here jumping for joy. And, you have the band playing. And that's what worship looks like to them. But when we look in the New Testament, and as we did last Sunday, Byron did an excellent job. I believe it was last Sunday. Time is flying by so quickly. Byron did an excellent job talking about how worship is to be done decently and in order. And the picture that this person painted to me of that kind of worship, it's not decent and in order. The worship that these people were offering to their false idol, to their false god, Baal, that's not decently and in order. Oftentimes worship can be quiet, can be subdued. Certainly it can be joyous. Certainly it can be somber. There is emotion in worship, but we ought not to mistake true emotion, true gratitude, true worship for what is often called emotionalism. Emotionalism in worship is the idea of, I do whatever I feel like and what makes me feel good, and I interpret that as worship to God. Worship is not primarily about us feeling good. It is about offering due reverence, honor, and glory to God. And if we feel good, quote unquote, as I guess you could say a side effect of that, well, good, we've been encouraged, we've been lifted up. But ultimately it's about God and what He desires and what He has prescribed. Another thing, Elijah's faith here. He is so sure that the Lord is God that he stacks the deck against him. And perhaps he has done so according to the Lord's command. It seems to be indicated in verse 36 where he says, I have done all these things at your word. Perhaps the Lord told him to do these things. But he has utmost faith. He takes the altar and sets it up and puts the sacrifice on it and the wood. And he tells people, get pitchers of water, which, by the way, would not be very easily gotten. Water supply would not easily be gotten, and certainly not people not willing to give that up because, hey, there's a drought in the land. But he says, you soak this altar, pour it. They said 4 pitchers, and he made it do it 3 times, 12 times on the altar, pouring water on the wood and the ox that he had cut up. And then they filled a ditch around the altar with water as well. He wanted to make it absolutely certain to these people's minds that there was no other way that this could have happened except by the hand of the true God. And he was certain that that would be the case. Now, I'm not suggesting that we stack the odds against God. We haven't been commanded to, and it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. I'm not suggesting that we should purposefully stack the odds against the Lord, but in situations where the odds are stacked against us and stacked against God, do we have the faith of Elijah? Knowing that the Lord is God and knowing that He is going to accomplish His purpose, His will. And He will show that He is the Lord, that He is God. Now, that doesn't mean that, say, a loved one of mine has cancer, and I know that the Lord is God, therefore they're not going to die. That's not how that works. We don't know what the will of the Lord is. But do you have faith that even if a person, it is said of them that they've got stage 4 cancer, eaten up with it, they've only got a few days to live, do you believe that God can heal them? Do you believe that that's possible? I do. I believe that it is possible. Whether it is the will of the Lord or not to heal them, I believe that it is possible. And that's the kind of faith that we need to show. The faith that Elijah shows here. So, of course, the Lord answers Elijah's prayer. And it consumes the burnt offering. It consumes the wood. It consumes the stone. It consumes the dust. It consumes the water that was in the trench. How could you look at that display and not come away with any other conclusion than what the Israelites do here? When they fall on their faces in verse 39 and say, the Lord, He is God, the Lord, He is God. The prophets of Baal had cried out from morning till evening. Practically a whole day spent. Their God did not answer. But Elijah's God answered immediately. And forcefully. And so let's finish up reading the chapter. Let's look at the aftermath. That should say on the PowerPoint slide verses 39 through 46. That's what we're reading, verses 39 through 46. When all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. Then Elijah said to them, seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape. So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon, and slew them there. Now Elijah said to Ahab, go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of the roar of a heavy shower. So Ahab went up to eat and drink. But Elijah went up to the top of Carmel, and he crouched down on the earth and put his face between his knees. He said to his servant, go up now, look toward the sea. So he went up and looked and said, there is nothing. And he said, go back 7 times. It came about at the 7th time that he said, behold, a cloud as small as a man's hand is coming up from the sea. And he said, go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down, so that the heavy shower does not stop you. In a little while the sky grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy shower, and Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. Then the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he girded up his loins and outran Ahab to Jezreel. So, the contest has been won decisively. The Lord has shown that He is God. There's still some things left to be done, aren't there? Number 1, we have to remove the idolatrous influence from among these people. And that's exactly what Elijah does. He says, seize the prophets of Baal, do not let one of them escape. By the way, I don't think we should read into that he did not also seize the prophets of Asherah, though they are not specifically mentioned. It would seem logical to me that all of them, all 850 of them, were destroyed. And so all the prophets of these false gods were seized, brought down to the brook Kishon, and slew there. They removed the evil influence out of the land, these prophets who had led them astray. And to Israel's credit, they did the right thing here, rallying behind Elijah and doing what was right in this case. But there remains another thing to be done, and that is the rain needs to come back. God said, go show yourself to Ahab and I will bring rain on the land. And so all this has been done, all has come about. God has shown that He is the Lord. But God is going to further show that He is the Lord. Baal's supposed to be the god of storms. Well, God just won the contest. The prophets of Baal have been killed. And now what? Elisha prays, and though it doesn't explicitly say that in this text, it says he crouched down on the earth and put his face between his knees. James chapter 5 and verse 18, or I believe James 5:18, talks about how, yes, he had prayed for it to stop raining, but he also prayed again, and it did rain. So I think it's safe to say that he's praying here. And he tells his servant, go look at the sky. And 7 times there's nothing, but at the 7th time, he sees this small cloud. It says as small as a man's hand. But from that cloud there was a great storm coming. Heavy rain, a heavy shower that came. And so the Lord once again shows that He is God. Baal, the god of storms, is no one. He has no power. God has power over the rain. His prophet prayed and there was no rain for 3 years. And then his prophet prayed again and there was rain. God shows that He is in control of everything. And there is no other God besides Him. This chapter is a powerful chapter to me. And it's one of those chapters that if I had the ability to go back and observe events in biblical history, I would have liked to have been there on Mount Carmel. As we wrap things up this evening, let's look at some applications that we can draw from what happened here on Mount Carmel. Number 1, even if you're alone, do what is right. Follow the example of Elijah. He believed that he was alone. In that instance, he was alone. And yet he was up against, at the very least, 850 prophets, not to mention all the children of Israel. And he stood his ground. He said what was right. He did what was right. And we too, in moments where we are pressed, in moments where we are the only one who's doing what's right, let's make sure that we continue to do what's right. As we've been studying Ezekiel and the Lord talked about how He was seeking a man to stand in the gap, let us stand in the gap. As we talked about a moment ago, let us distinguish emotionalism from true worship. As I said, true worship at times I believe will be emotional. There will be times where we are so filled with joy that the smile can't get any wider on our faces. There are times when we will be so overcome with grief or guilt or sadness that the tears won't stop flowing from our eyes. And much more complicated emotions therein. But let us not think that in order to be truly worshiping God that we must feel a certain way. Does not seem to be the case in Scriptures. And furthermore, let us not think that unless we are feeling good, that our worship is in vain. That is a lie told to us by Satan. Satan wants us to please ourselves rather than to please God. And emotionalism is one avenue in which he does that. Continue to have faith in God despite the odds. Don't ever think that God has met his match. Don't ever think that God cannot do what you hope for him to do. Does not mean that he will do. His will is different from our will in some cases. His will is perfect, ours is imperfect. But understand that he can do anything. We need to be willing to purge evil influences from among us, like Elijah did. We need to look around in our lives and look at the people who are perhaps making us limp between two opinions. We don't need to be limping. We don't need to be faltering. In the book of James, he calls that being double-minded. We don't need to be double-minded. We need a single-minded, purpose-driven service to God, knowing that he is God, that he is the only God, and that he is the only cause worth serving. Also remember that God is always in control. This kind of goes into faith in God despite the odds. We may not understand everything that's going on. Maybe Elijah didn't understand why there was a drought for 3 years. But understand that God is in control of everything. His perfect will is working in us. And yes, we have a free will, but God's will is always done as well. God's will prevails. So this evening, as we close, I want you to think about, who do you serve? Do you serve the world? Do you serve yourself? Do you serve the devil himself? Or do you serve the Lord? Do you serve Jesus Christ the righteous? If you have not obeyed the gospel, you can do that tonight. You can start your service to Jesus Christ, to the Lord, to the one true God. Believe in him. Confess him before men. Repent of your sins. Be baptized for the remission of your sins. And start that discipleship with him. If you are a Christian and perhaps you are faltering between two opinions, be double-minded no longer. If you have sin in your life, get rid of it. If you have sinful influences in your life, get rid of them. Totally devote yourself to the Lord and put your faith in him. If you have any need to come this evening, won't you come while we stand and sing?